Well, good morning everyone and welcome to day 2 of the 2021 National Landcare Conference. I'm Costa Georgiadis and I am content. I'm super excited and I'm so happy with what transpired yesterday. What an incredible conference to have shifted online and to have had all of you there at home, at work, wherever you are around the country joining us for the event, and then of course for the for the awards as well. But before I touch on that, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm here on Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to elders both past and present. As I mentioned yesterday, we're in the business of caring for country, and each and every one of you all around the nation have shared your stories in some incredible sessions yesterday, and we have a fantastic Indigenous panel talking about, I can't wait, I'm not going to, enough from me, you'll just see, I can't wait for you to see the videos and be a part of the panel this afternoon. It's going to be fantastic. Wow, last night, this place, there was no one here other than all the technical people, and speaking of that, at 11:15, when we break for morning tea, I want to take you for a little bit of a Facebook Live tour behind the scenes here so that you can all see and meet the people behind the scenes that are bringing you the conference to wherever you are. But as for the awards, what an incredible, incredible evening. Andrew Stewart in Victoria, big congratulations. So many comments came through on the chat from people saying how much they enjoyed seeing the recipients just in their places, and whether it was the Dimaroo Rangers up all together, excited where they were, or whether it was in WA or you know, Andrew at home with the family cheering and making noise. It was so personal, and what a wonderful honour for you to receive that award, and of course to the other finalists. Your work is fantastic and now out there for the whole country to appreciate and learn from. It was a very special awards ceremony in that the inaugural General Jeffrey Award was presented this year, and that went to Professor Lynn Abbott over in WA, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful to have her with us, and of course the Young Landcare Leadership Award, Danny Gilbert, who'll be joining us on the panel in the afternoon. Red Hill Bush Regenerators in the ACT for the Community Media Community Group Award. Floating Landcare in New South Wales, congratulations to you. I mentioned Dimaroo, the Woonambul Gumbara Aboriginal Corporation in WA, and Basil Schur in WA for the individual Landcarer, and the Amarula Dorpers for their Landcare Farming Award, Redbank Farm in Tasmania, and of course I mentioned Andrew Stewart. So congratulations to all of you, and thanks to all of you for joining us online. And the comments that we received were fantastic. You were all so engaged with it. It makes us all really pleased to know that it reached you. Remember that the chat is on again today. The chat that's been going on has been fantastic. Ask questions, answer questions together, share ideas, share links, share connections, which normally you would be doing face-to-face during the breaks, but that's fine. We can do it online. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I will continue to add pieces to my collection here today. I'd like to put this very special piece of mine here, as well as this little overseer. He's going to sit there. Chucky's been going well throughout the Now, there is a story to this, which I'm going to ask you all about. Chucky's coming up here for a drink. Maybe. And I'll leave the other things for my break after David. So now I'd like to welcome our first speaker today. Professor David Lindermeier from the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University in Canberra. Professor Lindermeier is an Australian scientist and academic with expertise in landscape ecology, conservation and biodiversity. His research focuses on the adoption of nature conservation practices in agricultural production areas, developing ways to improve integration of native forest harvesting and biodiversity conservation, new approaches to enhance biodiversity conservation in plantations, and improve fire management practices in Australia. He specialises in large-scale long-term research monitoring programs in southeastern Australia, primarily in forests, reserves, national parks, plantations, and on farmland. David, it's wonderful to have you joining us here for day 2 of the conference. Big welcome.
Thank you, Costa. Thank you very much. That's a lot to live up to, and I'll go straight into my talk. So thank you.
Thanks, David.
So this talk really is a move across about 24 years of long-term work across nearly 800 farms in Eastern Australia. And really what we're thinking about here is what we call natural asset farming. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So this work is underpinned by a big initiative at the ANU that connects through the Potter Foundation, a whole series of other foundations, many landowners, local land services, right through from central Victoria to southeastern Queensland. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this balance between production and environment is absolutely critical, given that almost 2/3 of the Australian continent's land surface is in some form of agriculture or grazing. And so what we're going to talk about then is not only some of the challenges, but what can be done about some of those challenges in a land care context. Go to the next slide, please. So many of these challenges will be familiar to virtually everybody on the land. The demands for increased food production, the reality of how much degraded farmland there is worldwide. An estimate recently had the amount of degraded land pretty close to the land surface of Russia. There are issues obviously with farm profitability, mental health, all of those things that are listed there. So these are some of the challenges that we've been working in and around in the Sustainable Farms Project for the last 24 years. Let's go to the next slide, please. So if we think about many of the labels that are given to attempts to improve natural assets, there's emerging themes such as regenerative agriculture. There's been others such as natural sequence farming that have been around for many years. And there are other labels that are applied to these kinds of approaches, but all of them focus on natural assets, or at least subsets of those natural assets. And interestingly, this is precisely what Landcare has been doing for several decades. Let's go to the next slide. So within the Sustainable Farms Project, we have a series of natural assets that we've been looking at from a scientific and monitoring perspective for over 2 decades, ranging from farm dam enhancements through to scattered paddock trees, rocky outcrops, etc. So what I'm going to do for the next 25 minutes is really give you a series of insights into some of the new findings that are emerging from that work. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the way that we approach this work is to indicate to farmers that all farms have natural assets. And we don't tend to label the way that we work as a particular kind of farming, such as regenerative agriculture or natural sequence farming, because some people feel disenfranchised by that. Rather, this is much more an agnostic approach where we can work with landowners, indicating that sometimes you only have to start at a small level rather than a completely holistic overhaul of the entire production system to start to make a difference. And some of these assets, such as rocky outcrops, have been largely overlooked for the last 20 or 30 years, but they can still have really important contributions to biodiversity in a sustainable farming approach. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the way that we work in our project is to take long-term scientific work, and we partner with, we don't replace the existing structures such as Landcare, local land services, etc. And we often have demonstration farm days where we talk about a key asset such as a farm dam or a shelter belt, and it's led by farmers with ANU as a backup with the science from the past couple of decades. And what we've been finding from our social science perspective is that attendance at multiple days in sequence often gives landowners and landcare groups the confidence to start to make changes. And the key issue here is that landcare is both an environmental and a social entity, not one or the other. And these two things go hand in hand to really make a difference in this space. Let's go to the next slide, please. So our work over the past couple of decades really has looked at not only the individual assets at a site, what we call a site level, but also looking at how they aggregate to a farm level and then also at a landscape level. So there's a lot of thinking and design that goes into this to provide the body of evidence to help people make good decisions. So let's go to the next slide. So these red arrows point to the large-scale long-term studies that we have been working with since the late 1990s to provide that body of information. Let's go to the next slide. So over that time, we've been monitoring tree plantings, protected areas of remnants, waterways, remnant paddock trees. And if we go to the next slide now, these are some of the growth types that we look at across that nearly 750 sites across all those farms. So old growth woodland, natural regrowth woodland, plantings, coppice regrowth woodland, amongst the kinds of vegetation assets that we look at on farms. If we go to the next slide, these are some of the attributes of the sites that we measure as part of this work, from vegetation to the animals to the attributes of the habitat. So hollow trees, rocky outcrops, the litter layer and the like. Okay, next slide. Now let's start getting into some of the insights for restoration that have come from this long-term work. And some people will be familiar with some of the things that we've found, and some of the things that we'll talk about are entirely new, including a paper that was accepted just yesterday on farm dams. So let's go to the next slide, please. So let's look at this first asset of farm dams, a really important part of the infrastructure of most farms, and a part of the infrastructure that's largely been ignored in terms of the potential for integrating production and biodiversity conservation. So let's go to the next slide, please. So there are an estimated nearly 1.8 million dams in Australia, and in the Murray-Darling Basin alone, nearly 650,000 farm dams. And at the end of the last drought, our analysis indicated that 97% of those dams were in very poor condition. And we know that very poor quality water leads to much lower stock weights. Estimates from the studies that are done in North America, and there's only 3 of them, and there's in fact only 3 studies done and published worldwide, that the relationship between water quality and stock weight will potentially be as high as 23% weight gain. Okay, so poor quality water can lead to almost 25% or a quarter of the body weight lower than you would if you had high quality water. We know that there are large amounts of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from dams in poor quality. And extraordinarily, there have been billions of dollars spent on breeding, pasture improvement, and almost nothing spent on water quality and farm dams. Really quite an extraordinary result. So let's go to the next slide, please. So a lot of our work at the moment is focusing on how we can lead to better management of farm dams as a key natural asset on farms. Let's go to the next slide. And we've been working on what happens when we fence dams. We create a hardened access point. We plant around dams. strategically, and what happens to the water quality. So let's go to the next slide, please. So what we do see very quickly, within 6 months, we start to see a major change in the quality of water. The water quality has much lower levels of fecal coliforms, salinity levels drop, water temperatures drop, which is very important, and we see less sediment flow into dams, which means there's less cleaning. So we talked about the weight gain work that's been done in North America. There is no comparative work in Australia. What we also see is we get very rapid changes in biodiversity outcomes around these farm dams. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we've also done some work that was just accepted yesterday, actually looking at the cost benefit of doing this. And what we see is that it costs roughly $4,000 to renovate a farm dam with the microfencing and the planting. But the benefit in terms of increased weight gain from doing this is actually quite substantial. So the benefit cost ratio you can see here is about 1.5 in New South Wales, and in Victoria, where you tend to have a higher density herds and flocks of livestock, the benefit cost ratio comes up to 3. And so the weight gain needed through a clean water switch is very modest, only 1.8%, even though in North America they have values up to 23%. So the probability of benefit being much greater than cost is very large, nearly 70%. So what we're saying here is that there's an option here to improve productivity through improved weight gain, but also have a biodiversity dividend through improving the value of the natural asset on a farm. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we can look at other natural assets on farms that really do make a difference. Paddock trees are one of those. If we go to the next slide, there are many parts of Australia that look like this. These are scattered paddock tree landscapes. Go to the next slide. We look at these trees individually, such as this one. Then we move to the next slide and we start to think about the importance of these individual trees, both on their own, but also collectively across the landscape. So the largest trees, the oldest trees, and the most vertically structured or complex countryside elements or natural assets in these farms. Let's go to the next slide, please. And they have really important values, sometimes overlooked, in terms of the largest trees have the most flowers, the most seeds, more likely to support mistletoe, and they also support the most carbon or store the most carbon. Next slide, please. So it's really important to understand where these kinds of trees are most likely to be found in the landscape. And so we've done a lot of work on this to help think about where you might focus your management efforts. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is some work that was led by someone in our group, looking at where these assets occur in the landscape. But most importantly, in the next slide, we now have landowners on our properties that we work on that are starting to think about recreating the paddock tree landscape through microplanting. So we know that larger plantings are valuable, but these microplantings are also very important. And what we see is that it's possible to think carefully about where you're doing this microplanting to boost the outcomes, not only for shade, but also for biodiversity. Let's go to the next slide. The one that we're going to focus on now for the next 5 minutes or so is on plantings. This is obviously an area that Landcare has had an enormous impact on over the last 30 years. If we go to the next slide, we start to think about what happens with plantings in terms of their biodiversity values, but also when they start to be grazed. So next slide, please. So what we're seeing in the last 3 or 4 years is that the fence lines in many of these plantings that were established in the 1980s and 1990s are starting to degrade. And as these fences are starting to fall down, there's more and more grazing access to these plantings. So it just happens that we're now got a population of planted sites that are grazed versus ones that are ungrazed. And we've been able to look at what happens before and after grazing compared to grazed versus ungrazed. And what we see is some pretty substantial changes once plantings start to be grazed, including intensive grazing, but also moderate grazing. And that is that the leaf litter and the mid-story cover is changed quite dramatically. And once we start to analyse this, we see some very substantial negative impacts on birds and reptiles. So if we go to the next slide, we have here a horrendogram, which is actually a path analysis, and it shows us what's actually happening in terms of the grazing regime, where plantings are grazed, uncontrolled grazing. It changes the amount of litter, leaf litter. It also changes the mid-story cover, and it drives down bird species richness quite dramatically. So we go to the next slide. And the next slide. What's happening is that we're also seeing background levels of changing climate in these ecosystems, including drought. So changes in rainfall across the plantings versus the regrowth and the old growth. And what we're seeing is some changes in the kinds of birds that are responding to these plantings during these climate fluctuations. So if we go to the next slide, one of the most important things that has been uncovered in the last 20 years of work, going through several droughts, is that plantings turn out to be critical refuges for birds, but particularly during droughts and particularly for small birds of conservation concern. So plantings really are an important part of the portfolio of natural assets on a farm, and their values tend to be quite pronounced during these extreme drought periods. So plantings really are important drought refuges. Let's go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that's really important is that the information that I deliver today is drawn from a lot of painstaking field work, which is then analysed very carefully and then goes through the very rigorous process of publication in international journals. So it's quite a rigorous process to be able to present this kind of information today. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we know that a lack of native vegetation in many landscapes is important for biodiversity. But we also know that when vegetation is put into the landscape without a good scientific basis for doing so, we can actually sometimes make things worse. So very narrow planted areas tend to be habitat for the noisy miner. And the noisy miner is a hyper-aggressive native species. It's a key threatening process in woodlands. So this species drives away other birds, particularly birds smaller than itself. And what we've discovered from our long-term data is that plantings that have an understory have significantly fewer noisy miners. We also know that where an understory is planted into an old growth woodland, the number of noisy miners also gets driven down. Now, this takes about 8 years for these kinds of outcomes to start to be seen. So if we go to the next slide, we actually see some of the data. So on the left-hand side, we see the probability of detection of the noisy miner in relation to the amount of acacia in the understory. So as we drive up the amount of acacia, we drive down the number of noisy miners. Now, the graph on the right shows the probability of detection of noisy miners and the number of years since there's been an underplanting in an old growth woodland. And again, as time goes on, we can drive down the noisy miners in replanted woodlands or in old growth woodlands. So if we go to the next slide, this may be offensive to the National Rifle Association in the USA, but the reality here is that instead of shooting noisy miners, which has been proposed and seems to be effective at least for a short term, our data suggests that it's better to tackle the problem of a despot like the noisy miner with planting and trees rather than guns. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, the important thing is that the noisy miner is not the sole actor causing problems in woodlands. What we see is that the grey butcherbird and the pied butcherbird, these are native butcherbirds, they don't tend to have major effects in isolation, but when they get together with the noisy miner, they have really strong combined effects, particularly on the smallest birds. And again, we discover that these effects can be remarkably reduced when we introduce a mid-story cover, not only in plantings, but also in old growth woodlands. So there are ways to deal with this axis of evil: the pied butcherbird, the grey butcherbird, and the noisy miner. If we go to the next slide, please. So here are the two culprits that work together with the noisy miner. And in the next slide, here's the scientific article that goes with the analysis that shows that, that synergistic problem. So if we go to the next slide, this is a little bit of a summary. So we know that the attributes of really good plantings are primarily in gullies. That doesn't mean we don't plant in mid-slopes and ridges, but gullies tend to do better for birds. Ridge tops tend to do better for reptiles, but that's another story. We know that bigger plantings are better than smaller plantings, but the context for the planting is the most important. So plantings that are near other plantings or remnants tend to do better than ones that are isolated. We know that block-shaped plantings tend to do better than strip-shaped plantings, and plantings that contain other features such as logs, large old trees, farm dams, and understory and mistletoe tend to do much better. And finally, plantings that are fenced and not grazed tend to be superior than where those things don't occur. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the reality here is that we only know this information to help us make good decisions from long-term monitoring. And this is often forgotten in an Australian context where, for example, at the National Gallery, we can fork out large amounts of money to buy the paintings, but we don't have the air conditioning to keep the paintings in good condition. And again, in an Australian context, we want to be able to do good science-based policy, but we can only do that if we've got good monitoring in the long term. Let's go to the next slide, please. So why do these on-farm land care efforts matter? Well, what's emerging through work between the ANU and the Department of Agriculture is that there are carbon and biodiversity incentive schemes being developed. And so what's going to happen here is that farmers that undertake good on-farm management are going to be rewarded through incentive schemes to undertake such work. So if we go to the next slide, please. So presently, there's a carbon and biodiversity pilot scheme running through Department of Agriculture. And just to reinforce that the aim here is to have cash payments for biodiversity benefits and to tag them to carbon credits for carbon sequestration on farms. And so the whole idea here is to start to think about biodiverse carbon on farms and looking at public reward for private management on farms. So next slide, please. So whatever name we want to call this, really what we're talking about here is improving the condition of the natural assets on farms. And Landcare has been doing this for decades, which is fantastic. But we've still got a lot to learn, and the evidence is critical because we need to make good decisions based on good evidence. And that means long-term monitoring, but also knowledge exchange. And that's why we work so hard within the Sustainable Farms Project to facilitate that exchange of new information. And that really means scientist-practitioner partnerships. And these will need to be long-term, not only because of trust, but because change in these kinds of systems takes a long time. And as we've seen in the case of the noisy miner, that can be up to a decade before the intervention to establish an understory starts to change the structure of that vegetation in ways that lead to positive outcomes. We go to the next slide, please. So we've produced a little booklet about ways to improve the natural assets on farms. And this has now led to a new book that will be out early next year about pretty much the same topic, but in much more detail. And if we go to the next slide, please. All of the information around plantings, farm dams, rocky outcrops, et cetera, is encompassed in this on the website from Sustainable Farms, which outlines the work over the last two or so decades. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer emails, send out information if people want to contact me at ANU. Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, David, for a fantastic presentation. I mean, the timeframes that you're talking about, when you say 8 to 10 years for these things to happen, but this is the investment that so many of the groups we were hearing from yesterday and that we'll hear about today. I mean, there's people that have been doing these things for 20 and 30 years. And what's wonderful about what you're saying is the statistics and the information that you're uncovering is showing that the results happen with patience and commitment.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's really important for people to recognise that what they do really does make a positive difference. And sometimes for some people, they can start small, for example, renovating a single dam, but it does make a difference. We see quite a strong biodiversity difference, a water quality difference, often, only within six months to 12 months. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, and when you talk about, thank you, when you talk about 1.8 million dams, I mean, if 0.1% of those gets improved, and you think about all those Landcare groups that are continuously looking for new projects and being able to do those and see, like they're almost like the quick investment in terms of inspiration for a group. When you see results after 12 months, and we've got 1.8 million opportunities sitting there for groups to take on these projects.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that's really beautiful about the farm dams work is it shows that there's a benefit for livestock production. They're drinking quality water, but there's a benefit for biodiversity. We see changes in water birds, bush birds, other organisms such as freshwater sponges are coming into these amazing places very quickly. It's really quite stunning. So you see a production benefit, a biodiversity benefit. Many of these landowners are now putting picnic tables and other things in these farm dam areas. So there's a mental health benefit as well. And the water lasts longer, so it's part of drought resilience. So, this is one of these really exciting win-win-win outcomes. And, we should have been doing it earlier, but now we know. So,
well, that's it. And what you're doing is giving people that information to leverage not just farm owners, but the community to the value of this work. And what I heard you mention there was that difference between block and strip planting, and how block planting provides that bulk. But then, that's not to say that the strip isn't that capacity. The strip is the joiner across the landscape, but then the blocks are the hubs that the wildlife can gather in but also move out from.
That's correct. So in the past, we've found that very narrow plantings do have some problems, but that means they're not without value. But there are ways to modify them with the next phase of work and improve them further without necessarily massive changes to productivity. That's the key thing. In fact, really well-designed shelter belts lead to significant benefits in terms of pasture protection, but also reduced mortality of lambs and increased shading for livestock. So there's animal welfare and animal production benefits too. So you don't have the same loss of lambs in the winter, and you have better outcomes for shading sheep and cattle in the summer.
Yeah. Now I've had a couple of noisy miners fly in some questions here, because we've got with the tech. I don't actually have the questions directly in front of me, so the miners and the pigeons brought these in. Is the biodiversity decline happening with any grazing present?
The biodiversity. So what's happening in plantings when those start to get grazed? Once grazing becomes very intense, there is a significant change in the leaf litter structure and also the understory. And the path analysis shows that drives down native birds, particularly small bush birds. And then we also lose some of the native reptiles, such as small native snakes, such as dwyer snake some of the geckos and skinks as well. So there is an impact of grazing in some of those areas of native vegetation in the plantings, but also when we start to graze intensively under an overstory of woodland, we lose the shrub layer and we end up with more open areas, and we also see a loss in bird and reptile biodiversity as well. So there is a grazing impact. So there are ways that you can manage that with fencing and strategic grazing to keep animals moving, for example, and give the system longer to recover.
Thanks for that question. I don't have the name of the person that asked it, but there's one here saying, how can farmers get involved? What's the best way you think farmers can get involved with this rectification and or start process?
I think there's huge opportunities for people now through Landcare is in so many places, and it's so important to support Landcare. It really is. As I said, it's a social as well as an environmental fabric in our communities, and so Landcare is very thirsty for knowledge to then communicate further. And there are ways for Landcare to partner with sustainable farms, but then there's also the infrastructure through CMAs, catchment management authorities in Victoria and in Queensland, and in New South Wales they're called local land services. So all of these organisations have access to our information, but other information as well from other researchers and other people. So there's lots of really good information to help them take the steps to make this. And they don't have to be huge changes to begin with. They can be smaller ones, and people need to understand that they can and do make a really big difference and a positive difference in this space.
Following on from that, this question was like, what sort of data is there on the impact of understory and mid-story? What's the key sort of data that you use to share this with people?
So we do extensive sets of measurements on lots of sites over long periods of time. So that means people out in the field measuring the vegetation cover, measuring how much ground cover there is, measuring how many birds there are, surveying how many reptiles there are, and then doing the analysis to piece this together. So we work out what plants are where and what's happened to places. Have they been grazed or not? Have they been planted or not? How has it changed over time? And so it's really building the body of data to be able to make good decisions. So when someone says to us, David, how do you know that a planting is better if it's 4 or 5 trees wide as opposed to 2? We can say, well, we've got 64 sites that we've looked at for 20 years, and that's what the evidence shows. And what that's important for is to help give farmers the confidence and natural resource managers the confidence to make particular decisions based on good scientific evidence.
750 properties you mentioned, or sites. That's a massive number of locations that you've been juggling, and for a few decades.
It is a massive effort, but it's a really important part of what we call the environmental infrastructure for Australia. So, often people talk about roads and bridges, but the environmental infrastructure helps us make good decisions as well. And that's what we work so hard to do. But we have to remember that farmers allow us access to their land, which is fantastic, so that we can make those measurements. And we have a wonderful team of people that work in places like Cowra, Gundagai, Wagga, Wangaratta, Albury, and they're field people that have very strong relationships with Landcare groups, with farmers and others. And that's fundamentally important to make this kind of exciting initiative continue into the future.
Wow, well that's wonderful to hear. And this quick question was just from Eric Smith. Where can we obtain a copy of the booklet that you mentioned?
If they write to me at ANU, we'll send out a package of materials, and the booklet is available now. We've just had to do another print run. That's fine.
That's great.
And then we have a book coming out with CSIRO Publishing early next year. But we have some others that have been written over the years, and I'm happy to send those out as well.
Well, what we can do is we'll get those details and we'll put them up on the Landcare website, and that way people can get them directly off that.
Absolutely.
David, thanks for a wonderful presentation and for answering those questions and being a part of the conference with us in 2021.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone that's been listening. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Cheers.
Oh wow, there was so much to take in from that. I'm very comfortable. I've got my clock there, but I did want to mention that, of course, everything today wouldn't be possible without our sponsors. So I'd just like to mention the Australian Government's National Landcare Program, Saving Our Species, and with the correct pronunciation today, Gallagher, even though I was saying Gallagher, but it actually meant that it got mentioned more. So maybe that was a good thing, maybe not. Now I can see our next panel popping up on the screen here, but as they get set and organised, remember to join us in the chat. You can also share any other thoughts on hashtag Landcare and hashtag Landcare. What was the other one? Landcare Conference. Landcare Conference. There's noisy miners screaming orders at me, which is kind of nice. Okay, now our next panel. Our next panel is Landcare and farming. Is the connection still valued? Now, this panel today is being facilitated by Dr. Shane Norrish. I can see Shane up there on the right-hand side of my screen. Great to see you, Shane. Welcome. And Shane will introduce our panel, Colin Seiss, Lucinda Corrigan, Alastair Rayner and Cam Nicholson. So everyone settle in for our next panel, and over to you, Shane.
Thank you very much, Costa. And before we move into the panel discussion, I'd just like to acknowledge the outstanding effort you're doing as an MC. So many people have made really positive comments, and I'd just like to endorse that and let you know that it's greatly appreciated.
I'm blushing under here. You can't see it.
And I'd also like to thank the event organisers and all of the tech staff that making this event so successful. There's a huge amount of effort going on behind the scenes, and so just wanted to make everybody aware of course, that that's all very much appreciated.
Thanks, Shane.
Rightio. So good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for joining this panel session. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from wherever we are all joining this event. I'm here on Gadigal country, based in Sydney. And I'd also like to welcome our panellists for the discussion. The first panellist I'd like to introduce is Lucinda Corrigan. Lucinda, amongst an enormous number of responsibilities, is a director of Rennie Lee Pastoral Company, a multi-generational farming agribusiness, family agribusiness that runs 3,500 head of cattle on Murray Valley properties. Lucinda is also the past chair of Climate Action and a former director of Meat and Livestock Australia. And she's currently the chair of the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit at the University of New England. Our next panellist I'd like to introduce is Colin Seiss. Colin is a merino sheep and cattle producer from the Gulgong district. He's well known to many people in the Landcare community for his pioneering work on pasture cropping, and he developed that over the last 25 years. Colin's been awarded many times for his achievements. He was the Conservation Farmer of the Year in 2005, and in 2014 he was awarded the Bob Hawke Landcare Award. Our next panellist is Cam Nicholson. Cam and his wife Fiona run a grazing property on the Bellarine Peninsula in southern Victoria. They produce wool and cattle for the long-fed Japanese market. Cam is a partner in Nicholson Rural Services near Geelong and is involved in various programs with GRDC, the Grains R&D Corporation, Meat and Livestock Australia, and of course, Landcare. He has been providing consultancy advice to farmers related to grazing, cropping, and natural resource management for a very long time. Our last panellist is Alastair Rayner. Alastair was previously a District Livestock Officer with New South Wales DPI for over 17 years, and he now runs Rayner Ag, a highly respected agricultural consultancy in New South Wales. He mainly services the grazing sector and is focused on beef production. Alastair is also a licensed stock and station agent, a counsellor of the Royal Agricultural Society of New South Wales, and he has recently joined the policy unit of the Cattle Council of Australia. I think you'd all agree that we have a wonderfully experienced and high quality panel to join the discussion this morning. However, before we embark upon that, I'd just like us to pause for a moment and consider the roots of Landcare and its long connection with agriculture. Most of you are very familiar with Landcare's origins. It was born out of a desire by farmers to turn around degradation of land and native habitat decline in their local areas. In rural Australia, it was and remains local people working together on issues of importance to their communities and farming operations. The Landcare model has been extremely successful. It's enabled farmers and other land managers to share experiences and learn from each other. The success of the model, which emerged in Victoria, had gained momentum in the 80s and drew joint support from farming organisations and conservation groups. I think the majority of people listening to this panel would have heard many times about the collaboration between the National Farmers Federation, led by Rick Farley, and the Australian Conservation Foundation, led by Philip Toyne, collaborating together to convince the then Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, to get in and back the rollout of Landcare around the country. I think it's important to remember that these two organisations were then diametrically opposed on some issues. I think we could consider land clearing and water use amongst those as examples. However, the Landcare initiative was aimed at restoring, better managing and protecting farming landscapes, and was way too important to let differences over other issues get in the way. And it's now been over 30 years since the national rollout of the Landcare movement. In rural settings, Landcare has effectively bridged conservation and agricultural production, contributing to the protection of natural capital and our economy. Please, I'd just like you to consider for a second what Landcare has achieved or contributed to in your area. And if we took Landcare out of the picture over the last 3 to 4 decades, what would our rural landscapes currently look like? I think we would have an enormous amount of catching up to do. Our panellists collectively bring a broad range of experience, and our key interest is to draw on their insights to understand how Landcare, encompassing the many members and groups and support organisations, can make a valued contribution to the agricultural sector. We'll treat this as a fairly open discussion, and I invite the panel to contribute wherever they wish to add perspective. The first area I'd like to focus on is the current strengths of Landcare. We know that Landcare has made an important contribution over a long period of time to more sustainable management of agricultural landscapes. And over that time, however, we've observed an enormous amount of change, both in our farming operations and where we get our information for managing our natural assets. There's also a lot of new activity in newer areas related to natural capital, carbon and stewardship programs. And Lucinda, I'll go to you first. You've been connected to Landcare since the very early days, and your region is the home of the very successful Holbrook Landcare network. You're involved in a lot of different agricultural industry initiatives. Many are high tech, and yet you still maintain a very strong Landcare connection. What do you value most about Landcare today?
Thank you, Shane, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. It's really a great pleasure. Look, I think firstly, it's the legacy of the 30 years work. So when we started Landcare, and I started my local little group, which rolled into Holbrook Landcare Network, we did that in 1989. And Landcare really made sustainable and sustainability a household word. So if you think about the UN Sustainable Goals that were released in 2015 to 17, I mean, most of those are things that inherently Landcare thinks about. And you know, we've had some discussions at the conference about, you know, mental health and all the other social issues besides obviously the natural resource issues. I think Landcare gathered up volunteers. It gathered up a community of people who were really interested in the natural landscape. And I come from a family that were great birdies and botanists. And, you know, there were lots of people, there are many people like that right throughout rural Australia, who had this great interest in the natural landscape and wanted to be able to talk about it and do more. And so that sort of was the genesis. And then we did so much of what I call the early learning, thinking about how we perennialise the landscape again, you know, protect our riparian waterways. So many things which I think now perhaps are much more business as usual. And it was great to hear David Lindermeier speak a little while ago about some of the newer work in farm dams and things, assets that perhaps we hadn't considered in the past. I also think there's been a number of stages. So we had those, what I call the really fun times when we all got together and did lots of voluntary things. You know, we're a bit more time poor now. So we went through the sort of the sale of the Telstra tranches, and then the incentive model, which brought other people in, which was good, of course. And now we've moved to this stage with the sort of the new products and the new markets. So I sort of see almost that we've sort of been in three stages. I just look at some of the work we've done through, and especially through Holbrook Landcare work, networks such as, you know, the rebirding of the landscape and understanding, you know, bringing what the value of bringing small birds back into the landscape versus the predatory birds and so on. So there's lots of pieces. And finally, I'd like to say, I think Landcare has assisted the feminisation of agriculture. You know, I've had quite a long career in agriculture, and I'd have to say it wasn't always as it is now. In my early days, I remember John Kerrin saying to me in 2014 that, Lucinda, the thing that's changed since I was Ag Minister is that there are women in the room. And so that is a great thing, and it's a great thing across agriculture more broadly.
Wonderful, Lucinda. I think that's an incredibly important point around the assisted feminisation of agriculture. And it's really encouraging to know that Landcare is assisting to facilitate that. Colin, if I could move to you, please. You've also been a long-term Landcarer, and in an earlier discussion, you've told me that Landcare did a great job in the early days linking conservation and agriculture. Through your involvement in sharing knowledge, particularly, I guess, around pasture cropping, you've connected with an enormous number of groups and individuals across the country. Do you see that positive experience of the early days continuing today? You're on mute, Colin.
What about now? Okay. In short answer to that, now I've lost track, is yes. Landcare will and should continue as it has in the past. And I guess one of the things that I saw in Landcare was when I was traveling and when I was in the US speaking at conferences and doing workshops, how much further we as farmers in Australia were ahead of the US in relation to farming and environmental issues. The American farmers didn't, at least at those times, have that same connection, environmental connection to the land as we in Australia have. And that, I believe, is directly related to the good work that Landcare did right from the beginning, uniting farmers and environmental issues, or combining them.
Thanks, Colin. Just to expand on it, what do you see Landcare's greatest assets currently?
I think one of the greatest assets they've got is are the coordinators themselves. The coordinators are an absolutely vital part of Landcare, and over the years have done a wonderful job. Without those coordinators, Landcare would not have happened, because they were the person in the middle that connected everything and combined everything.
Great, thanks very much. I think that's a really incredibly, very important point, that the effectiveness of groups are very much dependent on the support systems that are in place. Cam, I'll just turn to you. We all know that Landcare has a national footprint, but when it comes down to it, I think it's really a collection of networks and groups that have an enormous range and capacity. In some areas, we've seen a decline in the number of rural Landcare groups, yet in other areas, they continue to grow. You've been associated with the previously very successful Wadi Yallock catchment group in Southern Victoria for a very long time. What were the benefits that you saw that attracted members to the Landcare movement in your area?
Yeah. Morning, Shane, and morning, everybody out there. Yeah, look, I reckon there were several benefits that we saw from, certainly in the early days of Landcare, and I think it relates to locals could identify their own local issues, and I think that's a really important part of it. So, yeah, and we, in our part of the world, had heaps of salinity, rabbits, erosion, lack of ground cover, lack of trees, all the sort of things people speak about in Landcare. But we could identify those issues, and we could also identify what were the appropriate solutions. And I reckon that made it very attractive to people. What's my local problem? How could I go about solving it? And certainly in the early days, we're able to get that valuable support to connect those things together. So in other words, you own the problem, you own the solution, and you could move forward and actually do something about it. And I reckon for the first probably 15 years, I reckon community was well in front of government as far as policy and approaches. You know, they were leading, charging in front, and government in a sense was trying to catch up. And that had some other consequences, things like you could learn from each other as you were doing that, because people trust local. And so if someone else was doing it and you could connect those things together. And I remember when I first started in the 30 years ago as a part-time Landcare coordinator, I wouldn't be telling people what to do. I'd just say, oh, why don't you go and speak to so-and-so? They've been doing it. And so I'd connect them together. And I think those local problems, local solutions, people having a go and trying it and then sharing it with others reduces the risk of it, that sort of thing. But I also think, and I reckon this is an important context to have, is that at the time, that group type approach was the only game in town. Landcare and the way it operated, that model, we didn't have a lot of other groups doing the same sort of thing. So Landcare almost had some free air or some free space, I reckon, and that made it incredibly attractive to people.
Thanks, Ken. That's great points. I think that your comment about the value of connection has been a thread that's been in a lot of discussions. It was certainly a very important component of the wellbeing discussion yesterday. Yeah. It was something that a lot of people have valued, and I know it's clearly come through also in the comments that Lucinda and Colin have made. And I really think it, as you've just pointed out, the ability to share ideas with others and also reduce risk through that process had meant that it was very appealing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Where do you, how do you see your experience with Landcare in more recent times?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I've loved Landcare, but I think in some areas, as I think you pointed out, it probably is in a bit of decline. But I think if you take a positive spin on that, and this is my experience with the groups I've worked with, we've done a lot in 30 years. You know, if people have been plugging away every year doing stuff, you achieve things. I remember when the group first formed, it's because people were showing me photos of soil blown up against fence lines in the droughts in the 80s. We've had droughts since then. The country doesn't blow anymore. So people have achieved stuff. You know, one farmer said to me, how many times do you want me to fence off and retree my waterways? I've done them. So, you know, I think if you look at it from a positive spin, it might be in decline, but it's been in decline because we've achieved some great stuff. I also think, if I just add to that, that there are now other groups out there that have, in a sense, copied the Landcare model, for want of a better term. Yeah, you've got farming groups out there. When I started, there wasn't a farming group, or hardly a farming group in the country. It was Landcare based, but now I work quite closely with a group called Southern Farming Systems. You know, there's a lot of the characteristics of Landcare that those groups operate and use. Local branches, local structures, asking people, local solutions, that sort of stuff. We've got private advisors now that we didn't have 30 years ago. We have farm discussion groups. I see more now that are run by people that we didn't have before. So I think, you know, from a positive point of view, we've actually got other people contributing to the Landcare ethic and the Landcare outcomes that we want. So I see both of those as pretty positive. On the flip side of that, if you're looking at sort of the glass half empty sort of stuff, I think sometimes the regional prioritisation that's come in with NRM bodies and local groups, it's meant that sometimes individual areas that may have a small individual issue sort of gets lost in trying to look at that bigger picture. And I think for some people, they're sort of saying, oh, well, you know, I can't do the local things I used to be able to do 15, 20 years ago. And other things that are probably necessary, things like the accountability, the governance sort of stuff, as big lots of money sort of come into areas. And, you know, Cole mentioned the Landcare coordinators, and I think they are an incredibly valuable asset in that. But in a lot of cases, people have got to employ them. So you've got volunteer groups now employing people with various things that are required, you know, related to employing people and governance on where money is spent and accountability and those sort of things. And for volunteer groups, sometimes I look at that and go, oh, it's now getting a bit hard to do that sort of thing. And the last one I'll just mention very quickly, and I'll raise this, and I'm not afraid to raise it, is that I think there's some critical messaging coming from some in the agricultural industry about industrial agriculture. Some people are beholden to big chemical companies. They're not holistic in their thinking. They're not enlightened. And I'm just finding that divisive. I'm finding that as a real challenge to try and balance that up, because some people that I know that have been doing work for 20 or 30 years and have done a fabulous job feel like they're getting labelled that way, and I think it does Landcare a real disservice.
Thanks, Cam. I think that it was actually picked up by David Lindermeier very, very well, I thought, when he was summing up there. And he said, whatever its name, improving the condition of natural assets is the key. Yeah. And evidence is critical, of course, as part of that. Yeah. But I'd also like to pick up on your other point around what I think it's probably an evolution of the Landcare model, that others have seen the success and adapted it to be applied in different settings and creation of I guess, a next stage of groups and things like that. However, I think we all recognise that there are still an enormous number of Landcare groups that are very successful, and that's what this session is all about. How do we identify what Landcare does to add value within all the settings that are now prevailing within agriculture? Yeah. Alastair, I've left you to last, I'm sorry, in this initial round of questioning, but you've been involved in advising farmers for decades. First in your extension and advisory role with New South Wales DPI, and of course now in your own consultancy business. You've worked with Landcare groups for a long time through your involvement with New South Wales Local Land Services. In your experience, you would have seen some changes. Has the role of Landcare in the farming sector changed today dramatically as compared to what you observed earlier?
Thank you, Shane, and good morning, everyone. It's a very interesting question because fundamentally, I think the concept of bringing people together with a shared passion and a shared vision hasn't changed, and that I think is probably integral to nearly all the Landcare groups that I've been involved with. Is that commonality, that shared focus, the shared belief in working to make a position better, both for individuals but also for the broader community. And I think that's fundamental, and Landcare should never lose that. But I think there has been an evolution beyond seeing Landcare just in the framework of being about planting trees and fencing off catchments, to use a comment from earlier. There's a vision now about Landcare, and particularly the groups I work with, that farms have to be economically sustainable, and from if you like, the human resource base of farming, there has to be a framework around supporting individuals and people involved in agriculture to grow and be sustainable from their own knowledge base, and also, I guess, from a framework of support, a community support. And so the groups that I work with are very strong because they've evolved to ensure that they are addressing some of those other areas of sustainability. And so a lot of the work that we might do now is not necessarily seen in the framework of a sustainable farming practice, but very economically focused or very production focused, but is equally important because we're trying to bring together the messages of sustainable agriculture across a number of different lenses. And so I think that that's an important evolution, and will need to be an evolution because, as Cam said before, we've done the early bit, the hard work, the physical on ground stuff. Now it's about ensuring, if you like, a culture and a mentality that we all share, a positivity about agriculture.
Great point, Alastair. Thank you for that. I think that you've also picked up on the comment that was suggested by Cam around the evolution. And I suppose what you've just described there is adapting to the circumstances that are prevailing, and I guess a slight shift or an addition to the priorities that the groups that the Landcare groups you're working with now have. So thanks for that. Is there anything you'd like to add in regard to the current strengths that the other panelists have made?
I think that one of the important things, and again, I guess to pick up something that Cam had said about bringing groups together and having local solutions, and I guess finding resolution to problems, is the strength of that is through a group approach. But it's important also not to think that the group is the only thing about it. The shared learning that we have comes from, I guess, that process of being aware of problems, seeing it and adapting it, but having a network there to support producers who are adapting messages to adopt on their own farm. And as an extension officer, my job is to help people make change in their business. And it's one thing to make people aware. We can all run field days and we can all do stuff. It's that next process in how do we support that adoption on farm, and how do we make those messages adapt so that they do work. And that's the strength of the Landcare group, is that supportiveness to make that happen. If we don't have that, then all we're ever doing is creating awareness and no changes happen. And I think that's why groups sometimes fall over, is they don't go all the way through to that supportive adoption and how it works and why it works.
Thanks. That's a really great point. And I think that it goes very much to some of the comments that Colin had made earlier as well, around the importance of providing that supportive environment, and Landcare is a safe place to do that. I think through that series of insights that we've just heard, it's clear that Landcare still has some enormous strengths. It is adapting to the challenges that are prevailing. There's, I guess, a lot of value that we see within those strengths. But I'd just now like to turn our thinking to how we apply that value and how we take advantage of opportunities which may be emerging within the farming sector. We know now that there's a lot of organisations that are actively promoting the improvement of natural capital and productive land management. And this extends from the traditional R&D agencies such as CSIRO and universities, government agencies, the RDCs, and it encompasses now also the NRM organisations and not-for-profits. Fact is, there's a lot of really good organisations out there and lots of information. Landcare, I think, is now one of many players in the sector. Many farmers, and in my mind anyway, I see many farmers and land managers grappling with identifying the most reliable sources of information to guide their farming decisions. Alastair, just to continue with you, if I could, you pointed out that there's a bit of a shift and a lot of interest in production issues. And Landcare has obviously also got the focus, I suppose, on the improvement of natural resources. The NFF's 2030 roadmap has identified a target of 5% of total farm revenues to be coming from ecosystem services, and also a trend to carbon neutrality across all commodities. In conjunction with that, we know that the MLA have a target of carbon neutrality by 2030. How do you see Landcare most effectively supporting farmers and agricultural organisations to achieve what I think are quite significant targets?
Yeah, look, they are significant targets. And I think you have to look at it in the context that at that level where we're talking national targets, it's almost a point of that's nice to know. At the ground, we have the need to know. So somewhere we have to be able to help our producers find realistic production methods to ensure that we can achieve those targets. And just putting them in front of us in a presentation or in a document doesn't achieve anything. It doesn't help us go out to understand that if you live at long reach grazing in that environment, how can you as a grazier change your production practices to become more towards a carbon neutrality framework? So does that mean that you need someone to advise you on your genetics, on your grazing programs? How is that interface to be managed? And also, how do you bounce off and see what works in long reach? Does it still work in the New England of New South Wales? And so the framework has to happen somewhere on the ground. And as governments traditionally now have stepped away from that extension role, that supportive role that they provided in both advising but supporting, then someone has to step up and fill the gap. And I think bringing producers together in a format where they can work those on the need to know targets is going to be essential. Otherwise, it's just it's a dream rather than an ambition, and we have to actually make it happen. And it can only happen if we take it as bite-sized chunks on farm.
Thanks, Alastair. I guess really what you're also describing there, if I could just paraphrase it, is validating the I guess practices that have been developed or tuned in other areas to the circumstances that prevail within a different region or even within a different property, an individual property. And I think that it's clear that the Landcare structure or the Landcare model could be an important, a good facilitator of that.
Look, absolutely. And I think that we need to be conscious that Landcare, it can play a key role in that discussion rather than being restricted only to some of the sustainability messages that people often see as Landcare.
Thanks, Alastair. And look, you've obviously been providing advice to farmers for an extremely long time, and you, I'm sure, like me, see there is an enormous amount of information that's circulated on a very wide range of farming related subjects. with so many sources of information, how do you think that Landcare can most effectively support farmers to make good decisions today?
Yeah, I reckon, look, there's probably two areas there. And the first one will pick up on what Alastair was saying, which I agree entirely, is that I think a really important part of what Landcare needs to continue to do is to retain that core message about what Landcare is about as it evolves. It's about caring for the land, the water and the vegetation, which is, and biodiversity and all the other things that go with it, which is a really complex thing to try and achieve. And so I think as long as the core, that's what we're trying to do, but there's no one way or one method to get there. There's no one right answer, one right approach. As Alastair said, what works at Longreach and what works at New England is going to be very different. And I think what Landcare can provide and what it has provided in the past, and one of its key strengths is to be able to do that localisation, the testing, the localisation, the adapting, knowing that's the outcome we want, but there are going to be lots of different pathways to actually get to that point. And I think as long as Landcare retains that, Landcare will still have a very, very important place in our NRM going forward. The second one is around what I'll call sharing credible and supporting credible information. I'm probably spending more time now talking to farmers about alternatives that they're seeing, and should I be trying this alternative, or what do you think about this approach, and not dismissing them as saying they're snake oil or anything else, but there's now the marketplace information that's out there is sometimes conflicting and sometimes overwhelming in what's actually out there. And I think Landcare, certainly in that local Landcare group testing of stuff, is an important way to validate that that information, as you said. The Landcare groups, that is a key role of, okay, we're hearing all this, does it work? Can we adapt it in our local area to actually move us forward towards the outcome that we want? And I think that's an important bit that Landcare needs to retain, that idea about that, let's share and support credible information going forward.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Cam. I know that Landcare is highly valued. We know there was a survey relatively recently that it was a general survey rather than specifically related to farming, but it was focused on the benefits that people obtained from their participation in Landcare. And one of the overwhelming benefits was the value that Landcare provided as a source of information. And I think what you've just described is a really good role for Landcare as an honest broker, a reliable broker, whatever term we want to put it, but it's something that people can have confidence in. So thank you for that. Lucinda, you have so many responsibilities, and you would, I'm sure, see some great new concepts that come into your inbox and across your desk. With so many players in the sector and so many ideas, some useful, some yet to be fully tested, what do you see as the strongest opportunities for Landcare to more effectively to support farmers and add value to their operation?
Thanks, Shane. I think the biggest opportunity is really understanding what the millennials and Gen Y are thinking. We've got a lot of younger farmers coming into this area. So, we will ride off, well, I'll talk about myself. I'll be riding off into the sunset, I guess, in the next decade or so. And, we want this to be more than today and tomorrow. We want this to be more long lasting, what's happening. So I think understanding the needs, I've got 2 children in this business, and I see the way they access information quite differently to, when we started in Landcare 30 years ago, my son gets a lot of information from Twitter and from leads that come from Twitter. And I might say, have you read the science paper? And he looks at me blankly. So I think, that is very important to understand how the next generation wants to work. Secondly, I think we sometimes forget the lessons we've learned in the past. So if you think about the finance industry, and Pyramid went broke in 1990, and then HIH went broke in 2006, and we've just had the Greensill debacle in the financial markets. I think we see all these people with bright, shiny objects and lots of promises offering products to the farming community, and it's almost like we've got to run this lens over it, and that's where we need Landcare to be this independent, trusted broker with some scientific rigour, so that we are confident that, what we're going to spend our money on. We went to Beef Australia this year. It's hard to believe that event went ahead, 115,000 people over a week, and 5 of us weren't up. And there's lots of bright, shiny new things, digital gadgets being offered. And I suppose I said to my family, just everybody have a look at these and tell me if any of them have got any promise for us. And they said, Mum, they're answering questions we're not asking. So make sure you need that trusted group, that independent broker, to help you ask the right questions. And I think that's very important at a business level.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. It is clear that there is a very strong theme running through this responses and comments around the importance of good information. So thank you for that. I'd like to come back, if we have time at the end, to pick up on your point around the importance of getting the thoughts and how to work with young people in the farming sector. I think that's really important, as we all know that Landcare has been around for quite a while, and we really need to ensure we recruit.
I'll give you a hint, Shane. Wamaga my pub on a Thursday night.
That's probably a good option, Lucinda. Thank you, Colin. Thank you. I've left you to the end of this series of questions. Thanks for your patience. You've had close involvement with Landcare as a distributor of new ideas, and you've had a history of supporting farmers to consider change practices. Landcare has traditionally provided that very supportive environment that we've discussed earlier, and it allows people to test ideas and learn from others. With your experience and understanding how people are such an important part of Landcare and the decision-making process, of course, but how people adopt change on farm, and how should Landcare organisations and groups better support those individuals to consider and implement new practices?
Yeah, I think Alastair and Cam both nailed this one very well, in that any new practices or ideas that are out there, Landcare is in a perfect position to be able to get adoption of those, because we do have a structure in place and coordinators in place to be able to get those ideas out there to people. So I think they both nailed that exceptionally well. One thing that I have found that does work extremely well, because I've been involved with it, is mentoring programs. And they've been done through Landcare, but the most successful adoption of things I've seen is through mentoring programs with groups, like from that smaller groups, and they work very, very well. The key to that, there's a couple of things. The key to that is keep the group together. So, and especially if it's a new idea, then they're not one lunatic or one ratbag on their own. They're a bunch of lunatics together who can share this new idea and bounce ideas off each other, as Cam's touched on that, so they can share ideas and try things out and discuss it with everyone. So again, that the original concept of Landcare having a coordinator to organise those groups works very, very well, and it can be expanded into all sorts of new directions.
Thanks very much, Colin. Your comment around mentoring is, I think, very obviously extremely relevant and something that you've had experience in. But it just reminds me that the last night's winner of the Bob Hawke Landcare Award, Andrew Stewart, has a long history with a mentoring program down in the Otways, and it's been an extremely successful program, I understand. And so there's no doubt about it that mentoring should be a big part of the overall, I guess, support systems that Landcare should be able to provide. So thank you very much. We've covered off on strengths, and we now discuss some opportunities, and there's some very good threads that came through that, particularly around information and how those support systems can work. I'd now like to turn our minds to innovations and how Landcare has, I guess, always been an important part of the extension pathway. It's assisted to test ideas and undertake the validation of ideas that are in development or have been developed in other areas, much as we've discussed earlier. There's been lots of examples of those, related to soil management and even your own experience, Colin, with pasture cropping, shelter belts, destocking riparian areas, retention of paddock trees, productivity of native pastures, management of dung beetles, native habitat, and erosion control. The list is very long. But there's been some significant national initiatives that have emerged in recent times that I'm wondering whether Landcare has a role to play there. Examples of those, of course, have been the Farmers for Climate Action that Lucinda has a very strong association with, and I know that a lot of Landcare farmers are involved with. The National Future Drought Fund, and of course the new National Soil Strategy. Aligned with that is the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, which has emerged out of the Australian Biodiversity Certification Pilot. So there's quite a lot of what I think are very large national scale initiatives there. Lucinda, what we've heard about Landcare's strengths, but do you think that Landcare is well placed to contribute to these new national initiatives? And if so, do you have thoughts on how we can best achieve that?
Thanks, Shane. I think each of those initiatives will have a different storybook, because if you look at, say, the National Soil Strategy, I mean, you need a delivery. What is the delivery for the National Soil Strategy, and how does that work? And at the moment, it's pretty high level. So some organisations are in that space. Some, I think, the drought and the national drought resilience hubs will be much more sort of locally embedded. And I see that, we're going to have one at Charles Sturt University in this area. And so it will reach into the farming systems groups and our Holbrook Landcare network and so on. So I think it depends a lot on which initiative it is. I just wanted to tell you a story about at the moment, I'm chairing the governance board for the Sheep Sustainability Framework, which is a small job, but is oversighting the development of the sustainability framework for the sheep, meat and wool industries. And so last week we had a consultation with the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework. And we made the point, and I think it was very well accepted by the Australian Farm Institute, that the framework needs to highlight the jewels that we have in Australian agriculture. And we made the point about Landcare, that we have this sort of national voluntary, provider of information into natural resource management and all I guess the complex pieces that you've mentioned in a farming system, and that we want to make sure, that we don't just go off and create something new, that we actually have pathways already to deliver knowledge and information. So I've made the point, I guess, about younger people, and I think, obviously it's really important that we find ways to involve the young, and they've got their own networks, whether it's Future Farmers Network or whatever it may be, but they're so well connected. So I think that is the big opportunity for Landcare in thinking about how we deliver new initiatives. And again, I think it's this whole I guess it's almost sociology, but it's this whole way that we help farming businesses to ask the right questions for them. Do they know what their goals are? Have they set those? Have we got some natural resource goals? Because in a way, they're more strategic than the day-to-day of running livestock or getting a crop in or harvesting a crop. So have we got this sort of the operational or strategic, pieces in a business, right? And so there are opportunities throughout sort of, I guess, that, more layered approach to assisting businesses to help with some of these big new initiatives.
Thanks, Lucinda. Your comment there about asking the right questions. It takes me back to my research days and really getting to grips with what is the research question that is needing to be answered. And that's, I think, a fundamental element of understanding how we can support others. So helping people ask those right questions is spot on. So thank you for that comment. Cam, if I could go to you, please. And despite having, I guess, a long and successful involvement with Landcare over many years, Landcare and its members in your area have changed their approach fairly recently. Do you think that Landcare can still be a significant contributor to the land management innovation opportunities that are there?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. But it touches on the theme that we've talked about before about this evolution. Yeah. And I think that's, as long as we embrace that evolution in a positive way, I think that's important. So just to give a little bit of quick background on what you just referred to, Shane, the Wodiallic group that I've been involved with for close to 30 years decided middle of last year that they would discontinue as a group and have actually become a branch of Southern Farming Systems, which is our large local farming systems group there. That's taken evolution on both sides. Because we didn't want to lose the main characteristics of Landcare, and Southern Farming Systems were very accommodating to allow us to keep that model going, but it shifted some of what we were finding the challenging responsibilities that the new generation didn't want to take on. Employing people, chasing grants, accountability for that sort of stuff. So we've been able to find a model, which we hope, and going forward, fingers crossed, so far is working extremely well, that allows us to do both. You know, Southern Farming Systems got 16, 17 staff. That gives us some horsepower and some good scientific horsepower. If we can model that with the Landcare localised testing on ground and bring those two together and be able to get that support for chasing grants and doing things like that and governance through SFS, I think that's a model that will take us to the next 30 years. We did exactly what Lucinda said, went to the pub on a Thursday with a whole lot of the younger farmers. I can tell you they can eat a lot of pizza. And we just asked them, because I'm dealing with people now who I dealt with their parents when I first started. And so there's a generational change of the sons and daughters now operating those farms. And they didn't want to pick up the model that mum and dad had. And I think that's important, that Lucinda talked about changing the communication type thing that they use and the way they operate. Also, some of the business models that we may have had traditionally in Landcare, I think needs to evolve as well. And they said they'd love to keep this sort of stuff going, but they gave us an alternative model. And they said, we've got other groups out there we're members with as well. Why don't we get our heads together and actually make this better as a combined thing? So we've evolved that model. And when I think about it, some of those initiatives, like the Future Drought Fund that's come out, Southern Farming Systems are a node lead in our part of the world for that. Why wouldn't Landcare partner with those two and see how we can work better together on that? So I think Landcare can still do the core things it does extremely well, but there just may need to be new partnerships and new associations to bring that forward.
Thanks, Cam. I think another way that we may be able to look at that as well, perhaps, is that there's this enormous infrastructure there, and strengthening that infrastructure to be more independent and capable is obviously a positive way forward. So thank you for those thoughts. Alastair, from your perspective as an advisor to a broad range of graziers and red meat producers, do you think Landcare is getting left behind in your sector at all, or are these new national initiatives just opportunities for Landcare?
Sorry, I had to mute myself because I was depressed, because I realised that I've actually worked with Lucinda and Lucinda's children. So I didn't realise I'd been in extension so long. Look, Landcare's not getting left behind, and these are opportunities. But I think that Cam's touched on a really key point, which is 30 years ago, Landcare was new and it was fresh, but there was also a lot more people in rural Australia, and there were a lot more social, I guess there was opportunities. which are not there necessarily now. Our rural communities are getting smaller, and the models that worked in the 80s probably don't work as much now. People are really time poor. And so to stay relevant, Landcare itself has to evolve. And Cam said the model that worked for previous generations doesn't necessarily work for the next generation along. And we want that smaller group to pick up the responsibilities of Landcare, the responsibilities of a show society, of a bushfire brigade, of all these other things that happen in our rural fabric. And they also then want to get on with running their business. And so we collectively who want to work within that framework need to think about how do we evolve and how do we make sure that we have a framework where people want to participate, are supported in their participation and can grab those opportunities. And maybe these national programs are actually a source of funds that need to be coordinated by professional staff, a bit like Cam's talked about, that then can go to a group. And groups don't just happen. Groups require a lot of work and support to make it effective and to continue to kick goals. And so maybe it's more a framework. Landcare becomes a framework so that we can capture the opportunities to channel the right funds into the right directions to make the projects on ground happen. And that takes a bit of time and it takes a bit of resourcing. And maybe that's the role of Landcare as we move forward towards a new era where we're trying to kick some national goals.
Thanks, Alastair. Look, we're running out of time. Colin, I was hoping to go to you with the final question. I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to have enough time for it. I just wanted to let everybody know, of course, that we have a joint program jointly managed between Landcare Australia and the National Landcare Network, funded by the Australian government, which is called the Landcare Farming Program. And the insights that is coming out of this panel and the large amount of consultation that we have undertaken around each of the state and territories is feeding into that program. And so I would like to thank you very much for your thoughts and contribution today. It has been extremely valuable to hear your views and suggestions and identification clearly about strengths and opportunities and how Landcare can go forward. And so those thoughts in conjunction with a whole lot of other sources of information are being used to drive the Landcare Farming Program. For anybody who would like further information on that program, they can certainly find that on the Landcare Australia website. So thank you very much to the panel. I'm sorry that we don't have time for any additional questions, but I think that we will be very much benefiting from the input that you've had. Thanks again, all.
Well, thank you, Shane, for a fantastic panel, and to all of our panellists. Colin, it's great to see you there. I was fortunate enough to go out and visit Colin's property a few years ago and wander around with him, and I think we had Joel Salatin, and I think there was Peter Andrews. There was quite a mix of us, and it was wonderful to see what you were doing. And congratulations on a night like last night. It's wonderful to remember and recognise that you are a recipient of the Bob Hawke Award, and it was wonderful to see this year's recipient Andrew receive the award and continue the legacy that award now represents for Landcare looking forward. So Cole, great to see you. Cam, I thought you put it so succinctly with a sledgehammer in that comment. There's no one right approach. That was really, you know, we have that issue on Gardening Australia, like what we talk about in Melbourne or Tasmania. Like that's gobbledygook. We may as well speak another language for anyone watching the show in Darwin or the top end. It's just it's another world. They're managing their land and their seasons and their soils in in very different ways. And it's so important that we remember this. And it goes back to what you said, Shane, about that it is a conversation, and that the importance that we communicate, and not just my way or the highway. And that's what Landcare is good about. It is like an Olympics. There's people coming from all over, and let's celebrate those differences and communicate those differences. Actually, that's part of my wrap up this afternoon. Where am I going? I'll pull that up. So thank you, Lucinda. Wonderful words, and so nice to know your history with the work that you've done. And Alastair, thank you for your comments and making it such a great panel.
Thanks, Costa.
Absolute
Thank you
treat.
very much,
So,
Costa.
so now, as we head to morning tea, we're getting ready for the stream sessions. There's 4 great topic areas to choose from after morning tea. So the 4 of them are environment and climate change, sustainable agriculture sponsored by Gallagher, community partnerships in action sponsored by Saving Our Species, and Landcare impact. And like I said yesterday, don't be frustrated. Don't be like me and pace up and down and think, which room am I going to go into, and then miss the 20 minutes of the talk, because you can't get to them all. And don't worry, because they're all going to be on the Landcare Australia website, and you can watch them in the comfort of your own time whenever you want, long after the conference in the next weeks ahead. So before you go to morning tea, this afternoon's program, we've got lots of breaks for you to eat, refresh, stretch, do some emails, and the program has all the timing. For lunch will be 12:20 for 45. The afternoon break will be 15 minutes at 2:35. So we've got 15 minutes now till 11:25 for the stream sessions, which will commence. And then you'll be meeting me back here at 2:50 for a special afternoon with the Cultural Land Management panel and a film with Barry Hunter and Victor Stephenson, which I can't wait for you to see. While you're making your cup of tea, jump onto my Facebook page if you're interested in seeing the tech that goes on behind the scenes, because I don't have time to walk you through it during the conference. So you can jump on my Facebook page, which is Costa Georgiadis Official, and come for a walk behind and meet the team, because they're awesome. And I'll see you back here later. The stream sessions start, like I say, at 11:25. See you a bit later.